My name is Jack Losh and I'm a freelance journalist. Early this year, with a grant from the Pulitzer Centre, I had the opportunity to travel to the Central African Republic and report on the country's civil war. This conflict has caused a major humanitarian crisis, one that is very underreported and the international response to which is grossly underfunded. This country is not a household name in the West. It's a former French colony and imperial rule there was brutal. Independence of sorts came in 1960, but many French officials stayed on. Decades of dysfunction followed, along with a series of coups and authoritarian presidents. Perhaps the most significant moment in CAR's recent history was in 2013, when a mostly Muslim coalition of rebels known as the Seleka swept across the country and took the capital. In response, mostly Christian militias known as the Anti-Balaka rose up and carried out reprisal attacks. Now, UN peacekeepers have been deployed and a new president was elected in 2016. But this hasn't stopped the fighting. The rebel alliance has splintered into numerous armed groups which fight each other across the country for supremacy and for access to reserves of gold and diamonds. Atrocities continue to be committed. We're talking about mass rape as a weapon of war. We're talking about razing entire villages to the ground. We're talking about the ongoing recruitment of child soldiers. We're talking about torture and summary execution of civilians. And there is compelling evidence that war criminals continue to live freely in their communities without facing any justice at all. It was into this mess that I arrived earlier this year. I wanted to see how the civilian population was faring amid this nasty and seemingly uncontrollable sectarian conflict. This country is the least developed in the world, so it's not as if ordinary folk were on the strongest footing to begin with. This project would document life there at this turbulent time, exploring the roots of the conflict and meet with people on the ground who are working there to solve it. My month inside the country took me from the capital Bangui to two different towns held by rival rebel groups. One in the north on the road to the Chad border, the other in the east in Diamond Country. The same scene was repeated in both towns. Next to the peacekeeping bases were sprawling and squalid camps for thousands of displaced families. Outside of these protected slivers of territory were areas controlled by the local dominant rebel group. What I found particularly striking in Bria's camp was the high mound of earth piled around the entire camp. This, I was told, was to try and stop the bullets that were being fired by outside groups at displaced civilians and self-defense militias inside the camp. Another week, I travelled to the Chinko Nature Reserve to look at how peacebuilding and development are being tied to conservation efforts in this lawless and marginalised part of the world. The park was a ray of light in a very dark region, and the courageous work of rangers there is ensuring that critically endangered animal populations are bouncing back. What I found again and again in the country, despite the suffering, despite the entrenched poverty, despite the apparent absence of hope, was resilience, warmth, and humour. The local people I met had very little, and yet they shared their stories with great honesty and generosity. At the very least, I hope that their testimonies carried in my reports will not allow their plight to be forgotten. But more than this, I hope that these pieces will act as some kind of conscience for policymakers whose access to funds and political influence can make some real, positive and sustainable difference to these people.